Every generation of motorcycle racing has one moment where the sport can never go back. One crash, one decision, one tragedy. Not because it was the worst accident anyone had ever seen, but because it finally forced motorcycle racing to change. This isn't simply the story of one rider. It's the story of how one crash rewrote the future of everyone who came after. When danger was normal. For most of motorcycle racing's early history, the sport was contested largely on public roads, closed for the day, but never built for racing in the first place. Almost no runoff existed between the tarmac and whatever happened to be standing beside it. Telegraph poles, stone walls, hedgerows. The margin for error was measured in inches, not meters. Where danger genuinely couldn't be removed, it was simply cushioned. Straw bales, stacked around the most dangerous points, were the standard safety barrier of the era, designed to slow a sliding rider down, not to stop a serious impact. Helmets were basic, often little more than a hard outer shell with minimal padding. Leather suits existed to protect skin from the road, not to absorb a genuine crash. Riders didn't expect to be protected, they expected to survive. For decades, that was simply accepted as the cost of competing. The rider who never expected to change history. Gilberto Parlotti was, by 1972, one of the most promising riders in the 125 cubic centimeter World Championship. Italian, 31 years old, competing for the Morbidelli factory team, he'd opened that season by winning the first 2 rounds in West Germany and France. He wasn't chasing history, he was chasing a title. When his main championship rival, Angel Nieto, skipped the Isle of Man TT that year, Parlotti saw an opportunity too good to pass up, a chance to extend his points lead at what was, at the time, still the most prestigious round on the entire World Championship calendar. Nobody watching him arrive that week imagined this would become the race everyone remembered, for reasons that had nothing to do with who actually won it. The warning signs everyone missed. The Isle of Man's Snaefell mountain course was never a purpose-built racetrack. 37 3/4 miles of closed public road, over 200 corners, stone walls and hedgerows lining nearly the entire lap, a circuit that had already claimed dozens of riders' lives since racing began there in 1911. Riders had raised concerns about the course's safety for years. The scale of it made proper marshalling and medical response genuinely difficult. Help could be many minutes away from any given point on the mountain, regardless of how quickly it was dispatched. None of this was hidden information. Everyone who raced there knew exactly what the course was. The danger wasn't hidden, it had simply become normal. Motorcycle racing's approach to crash investigation in this era was fairly basic by later standards. Incidents were typically reviewed through rider and marshal accounts, physical evidence at the scene, and whatever course officials could piece together afterward. There was no dedicated safety commission systematically studying circuit design, barrier placement, or crash mechanics the way the sport eventually would. Safety changes tended to follow individual incidents, rather than any ongoing, structured review process. A race in the rain. June 9, 1972. The ultra-lightweight TT, the 125 cubic centimeter class, was run in heavy rain. Parlotti was leading the race on his second lap when he reached the veranda section of the mountain course, a fast, technical stretch of the A18 mountain road. In the wet conditions, he crashed. He died from his injuries. He was 31 years old. The race continued that day, as races from that era generally did. But among the riders who knew him, something had already shifted. Everything stopped. Not just the race, the sport itself. Why this crash was different. Riders had died at the Isle of Man TT before, dozens of them, across 6 decades of racing there. On its own, tragedy at the mountain course was not new, and it had never previously been enough to force real change. What made Parlotti's death different was who was watching, and how close he stood to the sport's most powerful voice. Giacomo Agostini wasn't simply a rival. He was Parlotti's close friend, and at the time, the reigning world champion. A rider who had already won the Isle of Man TT 10 times, more than almost anyone in the event's history. If anyone had reason to defend the race, it was him. Instead, Agostini announced he would never race the Isle of Man TT again. He considered the course too dangerous for World Championship competition and said so publicly, immediately, without qualification. This wasn't simply another tragedy. Coming from the sport's most decorated rider about the race he knew better than almost anyone alive, it became impossible to ignore. The questions no one could ignore. Agostini's boycott forced a reckoning the sport had managed to postpone for decades. If the reigning champion refused to race a circuit on safety grounds, the governing body could no longer simply treat each individual death as an isolated tragedy. The questions that followed were uncomfortable precisely because they'd been avoidable for so long. Could a 37-mile public road circuit ever be marshalled and medically supported the way a purpose-built track could? Could emergency response genuinely reach every point on a course that size quickly enough to matter? Was the entire premise of racing on public roads at World Championship level still defensible in an era when purpose-built circuits with real runoff already existed elsewhere? Other top riders began joining Agostini's boycott in the years that followed. By 1976, the Isle of Man TT was removed from the Grand Prix World Championship calendar entirely. A race that had been a fixture of the series since 1949, gone from the sport's top level because its own champions refused to accept its risks any longer. The answers to those uncomfortable questions became the blueprint for what motorcycle racing's top level would look like from then on. Modern MotoGP safety looks almost unrecognizable next to the Isle of Man TT era. Air fence and airbag systems now line runoff areas at every corner of a Grand Prix circuit, designed to absorb impact rather than simply cushion a slide. Helmets are now fully integrated, impact-tested structures rather than a hard shell with padding. Leathers include internal airbag systems of their own, triggered automatically the instant a sensor detects a crash beginning. Purpose-built circuits provide genuine runoff distance, gravel traps, and barrier systems specifically engineered around impact physics. Medical helicopters are stationed on-site at every round, with response protocols timed in seconds rather than minutes. None of this existed in any organized form before riders like Agostini forced the sport to build it. Rebuilding the sport. The shift away from the Isle of Man TT wasn't really about abandoning one race. It was the beginning of an entirely different philosophy about where top-level motorcycle racing should happen at all. Purpose-built circuits, already used for other rounds of the championship, became the standard rather than the exception. These tracks were designed from the ground up around genuine runoff distance, space for a bike and rider to lose control without immediately meeting a wall, a hedge, or a telegraph pole. Marshalling density increased dramatically compared to what a public road circuit could ever realistically support. Medical response times became a formal, measured part of circuit certification rather than an afterthought. New regulations emerged directly from the Isle of Man experience. As early as 1973, rules were introduced requiring that if weather conditions prevented a rescue helicopter from being able to fly, a race would be delayed or cancelled outright, rather than proceeding regardless. Rider equipment evolved alongside the circuits: heavier, more protective leathers, better helmets. All of it slower to arrive than anyone would have liked, but all of it moving in a direction the sport had never systematically pursued before. Motorcycle racing didn't simply become safer. It reinvented itself, deliberately, around the idea that speed and survival didn't have to be in permanent conflict. Every rider today owes something to that day. The distance between 1972 and today is not just measured in decades, it is measured in an entirely different relationship between riders and risk. A rider crashing out of a modern Grand Prix at 300 kilometers an hour will, in the overwhelming majority of cases, walk away. That outcome depends on runoff distance engineered specifically for that possibility, an airbag system already deploying before the rider has even hit the ground, and a helmet built to standards that did not exist in any form 50 years earlier. None of that is an accident of technological progress alone. Circuit design, safety regulation, and rider equipment all evolved specifically because a group of riders, led by their own world champion, refused to accept that racing had to look the way it always had. Every rider who walks away from a crash today is, in some measure, benefiting from a decision made by people who never met them, in response to a death that happened before most of them were born. A pattern. The sport keeps having to relearn. 1972 wasn't the only time motorcycle racing was forced to change this way. It was simply the first. In June 2016, Moto2 rider Luis Salom died after crashing in practice at the Circuit de Barcelona, Catalunya, at a corner sitting close to the trackside barrier. Race control changed the circuit layout within 2 days for qualifying and the race that same weekend. By December that year, the change had been made permanent. The corner was redesigned again in 2018 and again in 2021, each time adding more distance between the racing line and anything a rider could hit. In May 2021, 19-year-old Moto3 rider Jason Dupasquier died after a crash during qualifying at Mugello, struck by his own bike and then a following rider's. It was the first of 3 teenage deaths across 3 different championships in barely 5 months. The response, when it came, was sweeping rather than singular. Minimum racing age raised from 16 to 18. Grid sizes capped in junior categories, airbags made mandatory below MotoGP level, and work begun on an automatic warning system designed to alert following riders the instant someone goes down ahead of them, a project still being finalized for full rollout years later. Different decades, different riders, the same basic mechanism each time, a tragedy the sport could no longer explain away, followed by a change it had somehow always been capable of making sooner. The legacy that still lives. Every modern racing helmet, every airbag suit, every medical protocol timed and rehearsed before a season even begins. Every meter of runoff surrounding a modern circuit. All of it exists, in some direct or indirect way, because someone paid the price first, not once, but repeatedly, across more than 50 years of a sport slowly, unevenly, learning the same lesson again each time it needed relearning. History remembers the tragedy. Motorcycle racing remembers the lesson. A sport that will never be completely safe. Motorcycle racing will never become completely safe. Speed has never worked that way, and it never will. But every generation hopes the next one has to make fewer sacrifices than the last did. That's why the greatest legacy of Gilberto Parlotti's death was never the tragedy itself. It was proving for the first time that the sport actually could change when it had to, a lesson it would go on to relearn more than once, each time a little faster than the last. Because sometimes, the greatest victory in motorcycle racing isn't standing on top of the podium. It's making sure the next rider gets the chance to race another day. Which safety innovation do you think has had the biggest impact on modern motorcycle racing? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoy documentaries that uncover the hidden stories behind motorcycle racing, subscribe to MotoGP Decoded. There are many more incredible stories still to come.